An autumn wind, carrying the scent of rain and damp leaves, blew through the quiet streets of Westerville, a suburb just north of Columbus, Ohio. The Friday night lights of the local high school football game painted the low clouds with a faint glow, but inside the Westerville Community and Rec Center, the atmosphere was warm and filled with the mundane sounds of life. The squeak of sneakers on the basketball court, the splash of a late-session swim class, and the low murmur of conversation from a pottery studio blended into a comforting hum. He entered through the automatic doors, the swish of their opening barely making a sound. Here, he wasn't Lieutenant Commander Jack Corbin. He was just Jack. A man in his late 30s, he moved with a quiet purpose that seemed at odds with his relaxed posture. He was dressed in a way that drew no attention, a plain charcoal-colored Henley that hinted at a powerful physique, faded jeans, and work boots. His hair was cut in a severe, disciplined style, and his eyes, a clear, steady blue, swept the lobby in a single, practiced glance. He held a well-worn paperback, less for reading and more for camouflage. Jack was on leave. Less than 4 days ago, he'd been in the biting air of a foreign mountain range, the world a narrow cone of night vision and the hiss of radio static. Now, he was in suburban Ohio, seeking an antidote to the silence that always followed a deployment. He needed the noise of ordinary life, the shouts of kids playing, the gossip of parents waiting, the rattle of a vending machine. It was the only thing that helped him find the off switch for the hypervigilance that kept him alive in the field. He found a small, overlooked nook near a row of administrative offices, furnished with a single, slightly frayed armchair. It offered a clear line of sight to the main entrance and hallways, a tactical preference he couldn't shake. He sat, opening the book, but the words were just a blur. He was listening. A few minutes later, a new sound joined the chorus, the steady, rhythmic slosh and squeak of a janitor's cart. He glanced up. A woman was pushing a heavy, industrial gray bucket. Clara Evans looked to be in her late 30s, her features delicate but etched with a deep, pervasive weariness. She wore the standard-issue navy polo and khaki pants of the rec center staff. Her brown hair was pulled back into a simple, no-nonsense ponytail. She moved with a deliberate, quiet grace, as if trying to disturb the air as little as possible. Jack watched as she parked the cart and went back to a small utility closet. She leaned down, and a moment later, a large German shepherd emerged. The dog, Max, was too thin, his ribs a faint outline beneath his black and tan coat. He moved with a skittish uncertainty, his ears flat against his head and his tail tucked low. He stayed so close to the woman's legs he was almost touching her. When a teenager dropped a weight in the gym down the hall with a loud clang, the dog didn't bark, it flinched, a full-body shudder, pressing itself against her calves. Clara gently ran a hand down the dog's back, whispering something Jack couldn't hear. She clipped the dog's leash to the leg of the heavy cart, a solid, nearby anchor, and began to mop. From his corner, Jack watched. He'd worked with K9s, some of the best in the military. This dog wasn't just nervous, it was deeply traumatized. The low posture, the constant scanning, Jack recognized the telltale signs of a creature who had been taught that the world was a source of pain. His focus returned to the woman. Clara worked with a steady, almost robotic rhythm, her expression vacant. But whenever she paused to wring out the mop, her eyes would flick to Max, and for a fleeting instant, the mask of numb exhaustion would fall away, revealing a profound, aching tenderness. Then, just as quickly, the emptiness would return. Jack knew that look. It wasn't the tiredness of a long shift. It was the soul-deep fatigue of grief, a hollowing out that no amount of rest could fix. He'd seen it in the faces of villagers after a raid, in the eyes of his own men after losing a brother, and sometimes, late at night, in his own reflection. She was carrying a weight that had nothing to do with her mop and bucket. Clara kept her focus on the floor. Dip, wring, mop, repeat. The mindless rhythm was a refuge. It kept the memories from overwhelming her. It had been 14 months since the flash of headlights on a wet stretch of I-71. 14 months since the state trooper had appeared on her doorstep, turning her entire world to ash. 14 months since she'd put away her cheerful, cartoon-covered nursing scrubs for the last time. Her former co-workers at Riverside Methodist thought she was just taking time off to grieve. They didn't understand. She couldn't be a nurse anymore. She couldn't bear the fragile hope in patients' eyes, the beeping monitors, the relentless, cheerful optimism. It all felt like a lie. Cleaning was honest. A dirty floor was a problem you could see. You could erase the dirt and, for a brief, shining moment, feel a sense of accomplishment. It was a kind of penance, a way to make it through the day. Her gaze drifted to Max. He was her only anchor. She'd found him 6 months ago at the county shelter, slated for euthanasia, labeled unmanageable due to severe abuse and neglect. The shelter staff said he'd been rescued from a property where he'd been kept chained. The thin, pale scar across his nose was from a collar that had become embedded in his skin. They were a matched set, the woman who couldn't bear the emotional weight of people and the dog who was terrified of them. The center's manager, a kind-hearted woman named Susan, had bent the rules to allow Max to stay with her during her late shift. "This place can feel awfully big and empty at night," Susan had said, her eyes conveying an understanding that required no explanation. "It's okay, boy," Clara murmured to the dog. "We're almost done." Max's tail gave a single, hesitant thump against the cart. From his corner, Jack observed the quiet scene. He saw the woman's gentle reassurance. He saw the dog's brief, brave response. He saw the quiet man in the corner, himself, and the weary woman with the mop, Clara, and the broken dog by the cart, Max. And he recognized them all. They were the walking wounded, each finding their own way to navigate the wreckage of their past. He had come to the rec center seeking the noise of everyday life, but in this quiet woman and her damaged dog, he'd found a profound, shared silence. Jack leaned his head against the chair, the book forgotten in his lap. His mission to decompress suddenly felt irrelevant. He was a soldier, trained to identify threats and protect the vulnerable. He just hadn't expected to find his next watch in the fluorescent lit hallway of an Ohio community center. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the steady slosh of the mop and the distant sounds of a town that was completely unaware of the quiet battles being fought within its walls. The relative quiet of the rec center lobby was suddenly shattered by a series of sharp, aggressive barks. Not from a dog, but from a man. "Ki. Faster. What is that, a love tap? Hit the bag." The sounds were coming from a large, glass-walled studio down the hall, Roth's Taekwondo Academy. From his alcove, Jack's attention shifted. He had been a leader of men for over 15 years. He knew the difference between instruction and intimidation. This was ego. He watched as Clara and her cart, with Max trotting nervously alongside, made their way down the hall, drawing closer to the studio. She seemed to make herself smaller with each squeak of the cart's wheels. The studio door flew open, and a man stormed out, wiping his face with a towel. Victor Roth was in his late 20s, stocky and powerful, and he walked with a swagger that broadcast his self-importance. He wore crisp white dobok pants and a black t-shirt that was a size too small, straining across his chest. A 4th Dan black belt was tied with theatrical precision around his waist. He radiated a constant, demanding energy. He yelled back into the studio, "Another 10 minutes. And if I see one more lazy kick, you're all doing push-ups until I get tired. You hear me? Useless." Through the window, a teenage boy with acne and a humiliated expression flinched and reset his stance, his eyes fixed on the floor. Jack's jaw set. He knew the type. Victor wasn't a teacher, he was a petty tyrant. He established his authority by preying on insecurity, mistaking fear for respect. A man who needed to belittle a child to feel strong was, in Jack's experience, the weakest man in the room. Victor turned, chugging from a water bottle, and his eyes fell on Clara. She had just reached the section of floor outside his studio. She stopped, her mop held in place. "Oh, great," Victor said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "It's the ghost. Finally gracing us with your presence." Clara kept her head down. "Good evening, Mr. Roth. I'm just finishing up." "You're just in my way," he cut her off, striding toward her. He glanced down at Max, who was now hiding behind Clara's legs, trembling so intensely that his nails made a faint scratching sound on the tile. "And you brought that thing again. I thought I told you, this is a place of discipline. Not a kennel for some pathetic, shaking mutt." "He's not bothering anyone, sir," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He just stays with me. Susan said it was okay." "I don't give a damn what Susan said," Victor snapped. "This is my space. I run a business here. It's unprofessional." Clara's face was pale, but she found a tiny flicker of courage, not for herself, but for her dog. "He's a good boy. He's been through a lot." "Been through a lot?" "Boo-hoo." Victor took a deliberate, menacing step closer, then accidentally kicked the side of the gray cart. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was a hard, intentional strike. The cart tipped, and the heavy bucket overturned with a loud crash. A wave of murky, soapy water flooded the hallway floor, soaking Clara's sneakers and drenching the terrified Max. Max yelped, a high-pitched cry of pure terror, scrambling on the slick floor as he tried to escape the sudden flood, his leash tangling around the overturned bucket. "Oh no!" Clara cried, dropping to her knees in the cold, dirty water to untangle him. Victor threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Look at that. You can't even mop without making a bigger mess. You are absolutely worthless. He stopped. A new sound had entered the hallway. It was a low, deep, vibrating growl. Max, though soaked and shaking, had planted his feet. He was standing between Clara and Victor, his lips drawn back to show his teeth. His terror was still palpable, but his instinct to protect the only person who had ever shown him kindness was momentarily stronger. Victor's amusement vanished, replaced by a flash of narcissistic rage. He was being challenged by a dog, a wet, pathetic rescue dog. What did I tell you? He roared, his voice echoing. He wasn't yelling at the dog, he was yelling at the woman kneeling in the puddle. You let that animal growl at me? You bring a vicious beast in here? No. He's not. I'm sorry. Clara sobbed, pulling Max back, her hands fumbling with the leash. The tears she held back all day now streamed down her face, mixing with the mop water on her cheeks. I'm sorry, Mr. Roth. I'll clean it up. I promise. You're damn right you will. It's disgusting. You're disgusting, Victor shouted, pointing at her. Clean it up now, and get that mud out of my sight. He gave the overturned bucket one final, contemptuous kick, splashing more water on Clara before turning on his heel and storming back into his studio, slamming the door so hard the glass shivered. In the alcove, Jack's book lay forgotten on the floor beside his chair. His hand was gripping the armrest, his knuckles white. The ambient noise of the rec center had disappeared. All he could hear were the quiet, desperate sobs of Clara kneeling in the puddle and the anxious, confused whining of her dog. He had seen men like Victor Roth on every continent. They were bullies who used their position or their voice to dominate those they perceived as weak. And he had seen people like Clara, survivors just trying to get through another day, forced to make themselves small to avoid attracting the attention of those bullies. Jack Corbin let out a slow, controlled breath. The off switch he had been so desperately seeking, the one that separated the civilian from the soldier, had just been flipped back on. And it was glowing red. The echo of the slammed door faded, leaving a heavy silence broken only by Clara's stifled sobs. She was still on her knees in the cold, dirty water, her work pants soaked, her hands trembling as she tried to unclip Max's tangled leash. The sharp smell of disinfectant and grime filled her senses, making her feel sick. I'm sorry, Max. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her tears falling onto the dog's wet fur. Max was shaking violently, whining low in his throat, his eyes locked on the door Victor had vanished through. Clara finally got the leash free. She reached for the mop, her only thought to right the bucket, to fix the mess, to become invisible again. If she could just clean it up quickly, he wouldn't come back out. He wouldn't have another reason to yell. She was a ghost, she told herself. Ghosts don't make messes. Ghosts don't have dogs that growl. But the studio door opened again. Clara's heart seized. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. Victor Roth stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't gone back to teaching. He had been watching her. He had seen her crying in his puddle. His face was a mask of cold, smug satisfaction. I thought I told you to get that thing out of here, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Are you deaf, or just stupid? I am. We're going, Clara pleaded, scrambling to her feet, her sneakers squeaking on the wet tile. She grabbed Max's leash, pulling him close. I'll come back for the cart. She tried to retreat down the hall, to get away from him. But Max, feeling the surge of terror from his owner and seeing the source of that terror standing before them, planted his feet. He was a rescue dog, and every instinct screamed at him to flee. But his need to protect Clara was stronger. As she tugged, Max turned toward Victor and let out a single, sharp, defiant bark. It wasn't a growl of aggression, it was a clear, ringing accusation. In the alcove, Jack, who had been leaning back, sat up straight. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. The color drained from Clara's face. No, Max. No. Quiet. She begged, yanking the leash so hard the dog stumbled. But it was too late. Victor's face, which had been cold, flushed a deep, ugly red. A growl he could dismiss. A bark was a challenge, in his hallway, in front of his students, who were now watching silently through the glass. He had been disrespected by a janitor and her worthless dog. Oh, no, Victor said, uncrossing his arms. He stepped out of the doorway. He wasn't swaggering now. He was moving with the coiled stillness of a predator. No, we don't do that. We don't bark. Please, Clara begged, backing away, pulling the whimpering Max with her. He didn't mean it. He's just scared. We're leaving, please. He's not scared. He's insubordinate, Victor spat. You think you can let your animal bark at me? You both need to learn a lesson about respect. He took 3 deliberate steps forward. Clara was backed against the wall. I'll teach him what happens when he barks, Victor said softly. He didn't just kick. He was a 4th-degree black belt, and he wanted to make a statement. He pivoted on his left foot, his body turning with practiced, fluid power. It was a perfect, textbook roundhouse kick, the kind designed to break boards and win trophies. He aimed it directly at Max's exposed ribs. There was a sickening, wet thud that echoed in the hallway. The kick connected with brutal precision. Max didn't yelp, he screamed, a terrible, high-pitched shriek of agony as the force of the blow lifted the 70-pound dog off the floor. Max flew several feet and slammed into the lockers on the opposite side of the hall. He collapsed in a heap of fur and lay still for one horrifying second before his body began to twitch, a high, keening whimper tearing from his throat. Clara's response was just as visceral. A sound ripped from her that was primal, a sound of absolute violation. It was the sound of her husband's accident, of all the loss and pain she had been swallowing for 14 months, erupting in one agonizing wail. Max! She scrambled to him, falling to her knees again, her hands hovering over his trembling body, terrified to touch him, terrified of the damage she would find. Oh, God! No! No! Max! It's okay, baby! Oh, please, no! Victor Roth stood tall, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of his own power. He looked at the whimpering dog, then at the hysterical woman. A small, cruel smile twisted his lips. That, he said, is discipline. He brushed his hands together as if wiping them clean. Now clean up your mess. He turned his back on them and walked calmly back toward his dojang. In the alcove, Jack Corbin had not moved a muscle. He had seen it all. He had seen cruelty born of desperation in war, he had seen violence in its rawest forms. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. It was the calculated infliction of pain on the helpless for the sole purpose of feeding one's own ego. He heard the impact of the kick. He heard the woman scream, a sound he knew meant a part of her soul had just been shattered. Those sounds were the line. Jack's mission on leave had been to find the off switch. He had failed. In that moment, he realized there was no off switch. There was only the objective. The world outside his alcove, which had been a comforting blur of civilian life, snapped into high-definition focus. The lobby was no longer a lobby, it was an operational theater. The woman, Clara, was a friendly non-combatant, compromised and in distress. The dog, Max, was a friendly casualty. The man, Victor, was a hostile target. Slowly, with a deliberate calm that was more terrifying than any rage, Jack Corbin leaned down and picked up his paperback book. The soft thud as he placed it on the chair was the only sound in his corner. His leave was over. His breathing was even. His heart rate was steady. The rage he felt was not hot, it was a cold, precise, and lethal instrument. The silence that had been his refuge was now his weapon. He watched Victor's back disappear into the studio. A good soldier always waits for the opportune moment. He let his muscles uncoil and, with the soundless efficiency of a phantom, Jack Corbin began to stand up. Victor Roth felt a surge of satisfaction. He had reasserted his authority. The sound of the dog's whimpering and the woman's hysterical sobs were the sounds of order being restored. He brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his t-shirt, turned his back on the scene, and took a step toward the sanctuary of his studio, a smug sneer on his face. He never made it through the door. He didn't hear anyone approach. There were no angry footsteps, no challenging shout. There was only a sudden, cold shift in the air beside him, a displacement of energy so absolute it made the hairs on his arms stand up. He stopped, annoyed. Who would dare interrupt his triumph? He turned, and a man was simply there. The man had emerged from the shadows of the alcove, moving with a silent, fluid economy that was deeply unsettling. He hadn't run, he had glided. He hadn't stopped to check on Clara, who was now huddled over Max, shielding the whimpering dog with her own body. He hadn't glanced at the puddle. He had placed himself directly in Victor's path, a single, calm, immovable object. Jack Corbin stood with his hands relaxed at his sides. Dressed in a faded Henley and jeans, he looked like any other suburban dad waiting for his kid. He was broad-shouldered, but he wasn't posturing or puffing out his chest. He was simply, profoundly, in the way. Victor's sneer faltered, replaced by a confused scowl. He sized the stranger up and down, noting the plain clothes, the unremarkable appearance. He saw no threat, only an inconvenience. You got a problem? Victor scoffed, gesturing vaguely toward Clara. This is a private matter. Not your business, pal. Move it. Jack said nothing. His blue eyes were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. They weren't angry, they were assessing. They looked at Victor the way a surgeon looks at a patient, analyzing the problem before making the first cut. This unnerving calm, this complete lack of reaction, was more infuriating to Victor than any shout would have been. He was being ignored. "Hey! I'm talking to you." Victor barked, stepping closer, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate. He was used to people flinching. "I said, get out of my way." Jack remained still. He didn't even blink. Inside the studio, Victor's students were now pressed against the glass, watching. This was the final straw. He was being challenged and made to look weak by this nobody. "Fine," Victor spat. "You want to be a hero?" With a roar of frustration, Victor shoved Jack. It wasn't a simple push, it was an aggressive, two-handed shove, backed by his full weight and martial arts training, intended to send the man stumbling backward in humiliation. And then, nothing happened. It was, Victor would later recall, the most terrifying moment of his life. His hands hit Jack's chest, and it was like pushing against a concrete wall. The man didn't stumble. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't even rock on his heels. He simply absorbed the full force of the shove as if it were a mild breeze. Victor's brain, conditioned for cause and effect, I push, they move, short-circuited. For a frozen nanosecond, there was only pure, uncomprehending panic. He had pushed with all his might, and the world had refused to obey its own laws. He never had a chance to process it. Before Victor could even think to pull his hands back, Jack's right hand moved. It wasn't a punch or a block. It was a capture. It moved with the speed and precision of a viper, clamping down on Victor's right wrist. Victor's push had failed, and now he was caught. Jack's other hand came up, not to strike, but to reinforce his grip, creating a secure, unbreakable frame. Then, in one fluid, economical motion, Jack did two things simultaneously. He stepped slightly to the side, turning Victor's own forward momentum against him, and he bent his knees, dropping his center of gravity. At the same time, he applied a simple, devastatingly effective wrist lock, twisting Victor's captured hand in a way it was never meant to bend. There was a dry, popping sound from Victor's wrist. The pain was not an ache, it was a blinding, white-hot flash. It shot up his arm, bypassed his shoulder, and stabbed directly into his brain. His nervous system screamed. His tough guy persona evaporated, replaced by a choked, high-pitched gasp. He was instantly and involuntarily forced onto his toes, his body contorting to follow the unbearable pressure on his joint. He was completely and utterly helpless. On the floor, Clara saw the whole thing through a blur of tears. She had been rocking Max, whispering, it's okay," when the quiet man from the corner had intervened. She saw Victor's arrogant shove. She saw the man not move. And then she saw a blur, a movement so fast and precise it was hard to follow. One moment Victor was the roaring monster. The next, he was bent and broken, his face pale and slick with sweat, a sound of pure agony caught in his throat, held in place by the quiet stranger. Jack Corbin hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't broken a sweat. He had simply taken the violence that was offered to him, repackaged it, and handed it right back, amplified 1,000 times. He held Victor in the lock, the pressure constant, his blue eyes fixed on the bullies, waiting. The hallway was silent, save for Max's terrified whimpers and the strangled, painful breathing of the Taekwondo master. The hallway was a frozen tableau, the whimpering dog, the sobbing woman, and the two men locked in a silent contest of will. Jack maintained the wrist lock, his pressure steady, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't trying to break the bone, only to establish absolute control. He was giving Victor a choice: submit and de-escalate, or suffer the consequences. For Victor Roth, there was no choice. Pain was temporary, humiliation in front of his students was forever. He could see them through the glass, their faces pale, their eyes wide. His entire identity was built on their fear and respect, and he could feel it all evaporating. He was a 4th-degree black belt. He was the master of his dojang. He would not be defeated by this. This nobody. Rage, potent and blinding, surged through him, overriding the white-hot pain in his wrist. With a guttural roar that was part fury and part agony, Victor did the only thing he could. He violently twisted his entire body against the lock, sacrificing the joint for a half-second of freedom. There was a wet, tearing sound. Victor screamed, a raw, animalistic cry as ligaments shredded, but it worked. The sudden, violent torque broke Jack's hold. Victor stumbled back, clutching his right arm to his chest, his face a mask of contorted agony. You broke it. I'll kill you. He shrieked, his voice cracking. He was a wounded animal, and that made him doubly dangerous. Clara flinched, pulling Max closer. Victor didn't hesitate. This was his territory. He would show this man, and his students, what real power looked like. He reset his stance, ignoring the fire in his wrist, and launched his attack. He was fast. He started with a blistering axe kick, his left leg rising high, aiming to bring his heel crashing down on Jack's collarbone. It was a flashy, intimidating move. Jack did not retreat, he simply leaned, a fractional movement of his torso, no more than 6 inches to the side. Victor's heel slammed into the empty air, hitting the linoleum with a loud thwack that sent a jarring shock up his own spine. He hadn't even touched him. Stand still. Victor roared, pivoting instantly into a reverse sidekick. Another fast, powerful strike. This time, Jack didn't move at all. He simply raised his left forearm, not to block the kick, but to meet it. He angled his arm so Victor's instep, a delicate lattice of small bones, made direct impact with the sharp, unforgiving edge of Jack's ulna bone. It was like kicking a steel pipe. Victor cried out, a sharp gasp, and recoiled, his foot now on fire. He had inflicted more pain on himself in 2 moves than he had on his opponent. This was impossible. The man wasn't even fighting back. He was just standing there. Jack, for his part, was gathering data. First kick, flashy, poor balance, total commitment with no recovery plan. Second kick, telegraphed, fast, but left the entire torso exposed. This wasn't a fight. It was a performance. And Jack now knew all the choreography. Victor, now desperate, his face purple with rage and humiliation, decided to end it with his signature move, the one that had won him tournaments. He spun, a blur of motion, launching into a flying, spinning hook kick. It was a dramatic, airborne 360 degrees maneuver that would, he was certain, finally connect with this immovable object's head. It was the single worst decision he could have made. To Jack, the spinning kick was a gift. It was a move that required the attacker to surrender all balance, situational awareness, and defensive capability for one glorious, cinematic moment. As Victor launched himself into the air, Jack didn't back away or duck. He stepped forward. He moved inside the kick's lethal arc, completely neutralizing its power. Victor's spinning heel passed harmlessly through the air where Jack's head had been a fraction of a second before. And in that instant, Victor found himself airborne, exposed, and utterly vulnerable, his momentum carrying him directly into his opponent's space. He landed, and Jack was there to receive him. Jack's hands moved with a calm, clinical precision. He didn't punch. He didn't strike. He controlled. His left hand cupped the back of Victor's neck. His right hand gripped the man's hip. Victor, his kick having met only air, landed off balance, his feet tangling beneath him. He was a martial artist without a foundation. Jack used Victor's own forward momentum and executed a flawless hip throw. It wasn't dramatic, it was brutally efficient. Jack turned, lowering his center of gravity, and Victor, a man of over 200 pounds, was lifted effortlessly off his feet and slammed back first onto the hard linoleum floor. The impact knocked the air from Victor's lungs in a pained, desperate gasp. The entire exchange, from the first kick to the takedown, had lasted less than 8 seconds. But Jack wasn't finished. Control was paramount. Before Victor could even process what had happened, Jack was on top of him. He didn't stomp or kick. He simply dropped. His left knee landed with precise, agonizing pressure on Victor's solar plexus, pinning him, while his right knee pressed against the side of Victor's head, holding it fast to the floor. He seized Victor's one good arm and locked it behind his back. It was over. Victor Roth, the Taekwondo master, the tyrant, was pinned face down on the dirty linoleum just yards from the puddle of his own making. He was utterly, completely, and silently neutralized. The hallway was dead silent. Clara had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, her tears frozen by pure, unadulterated shock. Inside the studio, the students stood like statues, their mouths agape. Their invincible, terrifying master had just been taken apart like a cheap toy by a quiet man in a gray Henley who hadn't even raised his voice. They had just witnessed the brutal, efficient difference between a bully and a warrior. The air in the hallway was thick with a stunned, ringing silence. Victor Roth lay pinned, his face pressed against the floor, the smell of pine scented cleaner and his own fear filling his nostrils. The man on top of him wasn't just heavy, he felt like a solid block of granite, and the knee in his back made breathing a desperate, painful task. Jack leaned down, his voice not a shout, but a low, vibrating whisper meant only for Victor. You will never, he said, the words cold and precise, touch her again. He shifted his weight just enough to drive a sharp, agonizing pressure into Victor's back, forcing a wheezing gasp from the bully. And you will never, he added, touch that dog again. This is your only warning. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was off him. In one fluid, seamless motion, Jack uncoiled and rose to his feet, pivoting to place himself between the downed man and Clara. He was a human shield. His hands were empty, his posture relaxed, but he was poised for another attack. It never came. Victor was left alone on the floor, gasping for air, the humiliation of his defeat a bitter taste in his mouth. His right wrist was a throbbing symphony of pain. His left foot felt broken. His back ached. But all of that was nothing compared to the white-hot, acidic burn of shame. His students, they were still watching. Their faces, which usually held fear and awe, were now filled with shock and something far worse, pity. With a strangled groan, Victor rolled over, cradling his ruined wrist. He used the wall to haul himself unsteadily to his feet. He looked at Jack, who stood calmly watching him, his blue eyes unreadable. He looked at Clara, the cause of this entire disaster, now staring at him with a mixture of terror and awe. Victor's face was a mottled, ugly purple. He opened his mouth, to curse, to threaten, but no words came. What could he say? He had been utterly dismantled. He did the only thing his shattered ego would allow. He let out a choked sound, half sob, half roar, and stumbled away, cradling his arm, disappearing down the corridor toward the back exit. The moment Victor was gone, the soldier in Jack's eyes receded. The hard, analytical focus, the cold readiness, it all just switched off. The warrior who had neutralized a threat was replaced by the man who had been trying to read a book. The tension drained from his shoulders. He turned, and the transformation was so complete it was startling. Clara was still on the floor, her arms wrapped around Max. The dog was still whining, a high, thin sound of misery. She looked up at Jack, her eyes wide, still trying to process the last 30 seconds. This quiet stranger had stepped out of the shadows and vanquished her monster. Jack approached her, not as a conqueror, but with a quiet humility. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible so as not to frighten her. He knelt a few feet away, not looming over her. He's gone, he said. His voice, which had been a weapon, was now unbelievably gentle, a low, soothing baritone. It's over. Are you all right? Clara could only shake her head, her breath catching in a sob. She couldn't form words. She pointed with a trembling finger at the dog in her lap. Max. Jack nodded, his expression softening. Okay. Let's have a look. He edged closer, speaking to the dog in a low murmur. Hey, buddy. Easy now. Let's see what he did to you. He ran his hands, large and calloused but impossibly gentle, over Max's body. He palpated the dog's ribcage with an expert touch. Max flinched and whined, but he didn't snap. He seemed to understand this was help. Jack's touch found it, the unnatural give in the bone. His expression hardened. He's hurt, he said, his voice firming with a diagnostic certainty. That kick, he's got at least one cracked rib, maybe more. He needs to see a vet. Now. A vet? Clara whispered, the practicalities of the situation crashing in. It's so late. I don't know. There's a 24-hour emergency clinic on Route 3. I'll take you. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. He stood, offering a hand to help her up. She stared at it for a second, this hand that had, moments before, wrought such total, efficient destruction, and then she took it. His grip was warm and solid, and he pulled her effortlessly to her feet. My cart, she said, her eyes going to the puddle in the overturned bucket, her old instinct to clean up, to erase herself, kicking in. Leave it, Jack said, his voice absolute, cutting through her shock. He's the priority. He bent down and, with practiced care, slid one arm under Max's chest and the other under his hindquarters, cradling the 70-pound dog against his chest, careful to keep pressure off the injured side. Max let out a small whimper but then rested his head on Jack's shoulder. My truck is out front, Jack said. Let's go. Stunned into obedience, Clara grabbed her worn purse and the now useless leash and followed him. They walked out of the community center, a strange procession, the quiet man in the Henley carrying the broken dog, and the weeping woman walking beside him. Neither of them saw the side door of the studio crack open. A teenager in a Roth's Taekwondo t-shirt, one of Victor's most devoted students, peeked out. He had seen his master defeated, and his young mind processed it not as justice, but as an unforgivable insult. He watched them leave. He pulled out his phone, his thumb shaking with anger, and hit a speed dial. He slipped out the main doors, keeping his distance, and watched as Jack carefully loaded the dog into the passenger side of a dark, nondescript pickup truck. The student ran to his own beat-up Civic, started the engine, and pulled out onto the street, his headlights off. "Victor," he whispered into the phone. "It's me, Kyle. Yeah, I saw. He's leaving now. He's got the girl and the dog in his truck. Looks like he's heading north on State Street. I'm right behind him." Miles away, in a dark office, Victor Roth was pressing a bag of ice from a mini-fridge to his swelling wrist. His face was a mask of black fury. "Good," he hissed into the phone. "Good. He thinks it's over. He's going to the vet clinic. I know the one. Stay on him. Tell me when they go inside." Victor hung up, his mind racing. This was a disaster. His reputation was ruined. He needed revenge. He picked up his other phone, the one with numbers his students didn't have. He scrolled to a contact. These were not his students. They were guys he knew from his old life, a rough crowd from the city. "Hey, it's Roth," he said, his voice tight with pain and rage. "I've got a problem. Some wannabe hero put his hands on me. He's at the emergency vet clinic on Route 3. Yeah, with the girl. I need you to meet me there. And bring the bats. Yeah, we're going to teach this guy a lesson he won't forget." The 24-hour veterinary emergency clinic on State Route 3 was an island of sterile, fluorescent light in the deep, quiet dark of the Ohio night. It smelled of antiseptic and fear. Inside, the silence was broken only by the hum of a refrigerator and the quiet click of a receptionist's keyboard. Dr. Evans, a young woman with tired, kind eyes, clipped the X-ray film to the light box. "Well, the good news is there's no organ damage," she said, pointing. "But your friend was right. 2 cracked ribs here, and a third is badly bruised." Clara, who had been sitting rigidly, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's going to be okay?" she whispered. "He'll be sore for a few weeks, but yes," Dr. Evans said, writing out a prescription. "We're giving him an anti-inflammatory and a painkiller. He's a very lucky, very brave boy." Jack stood by the wall, his arms crossed. He had been a silent, calming presence, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging the room, the exits, the other 2 people in the waiting area. While Dr. Evans took Max into the back to bandage his chest, Clara and Jack were left alone. The adrenaline from the rec center had finally faded, leaving a shaky, raw emptiness in its wake. Clara looked at the man beside her, this total stranger who had risked everything for her. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. "You didn't have to do any of that." Jack's gaze shifted from the door to her. His blue eyes were no longer cold or analytical. They were just deep. What he did was wrong. Someone had to do something. "No one ever does," she said, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. "People just look away. They always look away." She looked down at her hands, the grime from the mop water still under her fingernails. I'm a nurse. Or I was. A pediatric nurse." The words just tumbled out, pulled from her by the gravity of his quiet strength. "My husband, he died 14 months ago. A car accident. After that, I couldn't be around all that fragile life. It felt like a lie. So, I started cleaning. It's quiet. I don't have to feel." She was confessing to a stranger, and she didn't know why, only that it felt safe. Jack was silent for a long moment, not with judgment, but with a heavy, profound understanding. He uncrossed his arms. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't know what it's like to lose a husband. But I know what it's like to lose people. Good people. People I was responsible for." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. In that sterile waiting room, 2 separate, profound griefs touched, and a fragile bond was formed. Dr. Evans returned with a bottle of pills. Jack insisted on paying the bill, waving off Clara's stammered protests, and then he was gently lifting the now bandaged, sleepy Max into his arms. They walked out the sliding glass doors into the cold, sharp night air. The parking lot was vast and empty, lit by the weak orange glow of sodium lamps. It was too quiet. Jack's truck was parked in a well-lit spot, but as they approached, he slowed. He stopped, his head tilting slightly. "What is it?" Clara asked. "Stay close," Jack said. His voice had changed. The gentleness was gone. It was flat and hard. It was the voice from the hallway. A car parked in the darkness at the far end of the lot, a car Jack had noted as empty when they arrived, suddenly flashed its high beams, momentarily blinding them. Almost simultaneously, 2 other vehicles, a sedan and an old minivan, which had been parked in the shadows, roared to life, their headlights cutting across the asphalt, boxing them in. "Jack," Clara breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Get behind me," he ordered, not looking at her, already shifting, placing his body between her and the emerging threat. Car doors opened. Victor Roth stepped out of the first car, his face a mask of contorted rage. His right arm was in a crude sling made from a sweatshirt. "You like this?" Victor screamed, his voice cracking with fury, gesturing to his injured arm. "You think you can humiliate me and walk away? You broke my wrist, you son of a bitch." From the other cars, men emerged. These were not his students. These were 5 large, rough-looking men in hoodies and heavy jackets. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, spat on the pavement. They fanned out, and the light from the headlamps glinted off metal. They were all holding aluminum baseball bats. "Now," Victor hissed, his eyes wild, "we're going to break every bone in your body." This wasn't a fight. This was an ambush. Clara's mind went blank with terror. She was frozen. But Jack was not. The man who had gently held her hand, who had spoken of loss, was gone. In his place was something else, something terrifyingly efficient. He didn't speak. He didn't negotiate. In one explosive motion, he spun. He shoved Clara hard toward his truck. "Get down. Behind the engine block. Stay down." It wasn't a request. It was a command, barked with the force of a rifle shot. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He tossed the sleeping Max onto the soft tonneau cover of his truck bed, out of the immediate line of fire, and turned to face the 5 men advancing on him, with Victor hanging back to watch his revenge unfold. The 5 men, confident in their numbers and weapons, spread out to flank him. "Get him!" Victor shrieked. The first man, the big one with the shaved head, swung his bat in a heavy, horizontal arc aimed at Jack's ribs. Jack didn't dodge or block. He moved forward, inside the swing's arc. The bat hissed through the air where he had just been. Jack's left hand shot out, not in a punch, but in a stiff, open-handed strike to the man's throat. The man dropped the bat, his hands flying to his neck as he made a horrible gagging sound. Jack's right hand snatched the falling bat from the air. The second man, coming from the right, saw an opening and swung. Jack was already in motion. He didn't swing the bat like a ballplayer. He used it as a short staff, jabbing it forward into the man's kneecap. A sickening crack echoed in the lot, followed by a high, thin scream. The man collapsed, his leg folding at an unnatural angle. 2 down. 4 seconds. The third and fourth men hesitated, their confidence evaporating. They attacked together. Jack dropped the bat. It was too slow. He met the third man's wild, panicked swing, deflecting the bat upward with one hand and driving a vicious, short-range elbow strike into the man's temple. The man's eyes rolled back, and he fell like a sack of rocks. The fourth man, seeing this, tried to backpedal, to turn and run. Jack closed the distance in a single step, his palm heel striking the man's nose with a wet, crunching sound. Clara, peeking over the hood of the truck, her heart hammering against her ribs, saw it all in surreal flashes of light. It wasn't a fight. It was a deletion. He wasn't brawling. He was a machine, moving with brutal, terrifying speed. And he was protecting her. The fifth man just dropped his bat and put his hands up, backing away, his eyes wide with terror. Jack didn't even glance at him. He stood in the center of the carnage, breathing evenly, surrounded by 4 groaning men. He turned his head, his gaze cutting through the high beams, and locked his eyes on the one man left standing. Victor. Victor's jaw was slack. His plan, his revenge, his crew, all of it had been dismantled in less than 15 seconds. The man he'd come to destroy was standing there, unharmed, a phantom in the headlights. Terror, cold and absolute, finally extinguished his rage. He stumbled backward, fumbling for his car door. Jack just watched him, letting him go. The mission was complete. The threat was neutralized. The parking lot erupted in a cacophony of flashing red and blue lights. The sudden shriek of sirens had cut through the night, arriving with a speed that surprised even Jack. As Victor's car had screeched out of the lot, 2 Westerville police cruisers, their lights already on, had rounded the corner, responding to a frantic 911 call from inside the clinic. Dr. Evans and the clinic's receptionist were standing by the glass doors, their faces white. "We saw the whole thing on the security camera." The receptionist was yelling to the first officer. They had bats. They were going to kill him. Officer Miller, a veteran cop with tired eyes, stepped out of her cruiser and took in the scene. She saw 4 men moaning on the pavement, a fifth sitting on the curb with his hands on his head, a collection of aluminum bats, and one very calm man and a Henley standing protectively near a woman by a truck. "Well," she said to her partner, "this is going to be a long report." Jack met them, his hands open and away from his body. "Officer, my name is Jack Corbin. This woman, Clara Evans, and I were ambushed. These men, led by a man named Victor Roth, blocked us in and attacked us with weapons." Clara, her voice shaking but her resolve hardened, stepped forward. "It's true. He hurt my dog earlier tonight, and Jack stopped him. This was revenge." The fifth man, the one who had surrendered, was babbling. "I didn't do anything. It was Roth's idea. He told us to bring the bats. That guy. He's not human." Officer Miller sighed. A clear-cut case of self-defense, a co-conspirator's confession, multiple weapons, and a high-definition security camera. She keyed her radio. "Dispatch, put out a bolo for a Victor Roth, fleeing the scene of an assault. And advise the arresting unit. His accomplices have been neutralized. By one individual." Justice, in the end, was swift and methodical. With the high-definition video, the testimony from the vet staff, the confession, and the clear evidence of a planned, premeditated attack, Victor Roth and his crew were facing a long list of felony charges, from aggravated assault and conspiracy all the way down to animal cruelty for the act that had started it all. The last few days of Jack's leave were not spent in quiet solitude. They were spent in the small, clean, quiet apartment of Clara Evans. After the police had taken their statements, after the adrenaline had finally receded, leaving them both shaking, he had driven her home. He had carried a sleeping, medicated Max up the 2 flights of stairs to her door, and he had simply stayed. He sat in the worn armchair in her living room while she showered. When she emerged, pale and wrapped in a thick robe, he had a mug of hot tea waiting for her. He didn't pry or ask questions. He was just there, a solid, calming presence in her small world, a sea wall against which the storm had finally broken. The next day, he came back with coffee and a bag of dog treats. He found a squeaky hinge on her kitchen cabinet and fixed it with a small tool from his truck. He watched her struggle with Max, who was sore and now associated his protective rib bandage with pain, snapping at her in fear. "May I?" Jack asked. He sat on the floor with the dog, speaking in the same low, calm baritone he'd used in the clinic. He laid the bandage out. He put a treat on it. He let Max approach it in his own time. He showed the dog there was no threat. This, he explained to Clara, was about building trust. It was a lesson for them both. They sat on her small balcony that evening, the lights of the suburb sprawling below them. They talked, not about the fight, but about the before. She told him about her husband, about his easy laugh, about the crushing silence he'd left behind. He told her, for the first time, about his last mission, about the young communications specialist he'd lost, a kid from Indiana who had just had his first child. He spoke of the heavy weight of command and the what-ifs that never truly leave. They were 2 people defined by loss, finding a fragile, living connection in the aftermath. All too soon, his leave was over. He had to be at the air base before dawn. He came to her apartment one last time to say goodbye. He knocked, and she opened the door. Max, who had been sleeping, lifted his head. His ribs were healing, but his spirit was mending faster. He stood up, walked over to Jack, and for the first time, licked his hand before lying down with a contented sigh at Jack's feet. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He's never done that with anyone but me." "He's a good judge of character," Jack said softly, scratching Max behind the ears. An awkward, heavy silence hung between them. The hero, the protector, he was also just a man, and he was leaving. "Thank you," Clara whispered, twisting the hem of her sweater. "For everything. You saved us, Jack. In every way that matters." "You're a survivor, Clara," he said, meeting her gaze. His eyes were no longer cold or distant. They were warm. "You and Max, you just needed a little support. You did all the hard work." He glanced at his watch. It was time. "Stay safe." He turned to go. It was what he did. He left. "Will you?" Her voice was so small he almost missed it. "Will I see you again?" Jack stopped in the doorway, his back to her. He was a man of missions and goodbyes. But this felt different. He turned back, and a small, rare, utterly disarming smile touched the corners of his mouth, lighting up his blue eyes. "I'll be back," he promised. Clara Evans stood in her doorway with her dog at her feet and watched him walk down the hall. And for the first time in 14 long, dark months, she didn't feel alone. She felt hope.